Celebrimbor has a lot to live up to, since his grandfather was the greatest smith in Middle-earth history. This might have been to Celebrimbor's demise. However, he sought to make things right before passing away. Join Jared and I as we discuss what the lore gives us on Celebrimbor, and how Rings of Power either follows the lore or tacks on their own agenda. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the White City Podcast. Today, I've got back with me, Jared Stonefield. It's good to have you back, Jared.
Good to be back.
Yep, and we're going to be talking on Celebrimbor and considering some, comparisons between the lore and Rings of Power, and trying to tie some themes into his role. Specifically, looking at Middle Earth, we have very much a world of universal morality. So a lot of sense there's a clear kind of right and wrong throughout the stories. So I guess, but maybe like before we get into that, what's some kind of origin to Celebrimbor backstory? Did he start in Valinor or that kind of thing? Did he have parents?
Yeah, so Celebrimbor has a fascinating history. We don't know too much about his earlier years, his early history, but we know quite a bit about his family. Specifically that he was the grandson of Feanor. For any Tolkien fan who has read the Silmarillion, Feanor is a name that brings up a lot of mixed emotions. Feanor is the greatest of all elven smiths who ever lived, arguably the greatest craftsman in Middle-earth and Valinor's history. And unfortunately, his creations were so incredible that they caused a lot of problems. Everyone, wanted to get after each other to try and get them. And he was also obsessively attached to his own works, specifically the Silmarils. The three Silmarils containing the light of the two trees of Valinor were basically the most beautiful, incredible objects in all of Middle-earth's history. And those three jewels that Feanor created started a horrible war that sank an entire continent. So Celebrimbor is Feanor's grandson, and Celebrimbor kind of grew up in the shadow of Feanor. Celebrimbor was very gifted in the arts and craftsmanship. He actually was said to have almost a dwarf-like obsession with the earth and crafting things from it. And so Celebrimbor actually had a very interesting father. His father was a son of Feanor, and his father was not a good person. He was responsible for kinslaying with other elves, not once, but twice, if I remember. It actually might even be a third time, but definitely twice. And when Celebrimbor learned about his father's actions, he basically disassociated himself with his father. And he instead went down to Eregion, specifically the city Ostenadil, which is where a lot of the Rings of Power Season 2 takes place, for reference. And yeah, so Celebrimbor was a very good guy. He was a very he had a lot of flaws, but he was overall very concerned, with keeping goodness, keeping light, keeping purity, seeking after beauty. And that was definitely, I think, something that was inspired by his grandfather. But he always kind of lived in that shadow because the Smiths of Eregion, Tolkien specifically says, they never lived up to Feanor. They surpassed all other dwarves, all other elves in craftsmanship, except Feanor. So I think that provides a lot of context for Celebrimbor's motivations, specifically by the time that the Rings of Power come into play.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that in a lot of stories in Middle-earth and Lord of the Rings, you have characters who have to make decisions. So what are some moral dilemmas that Celebrimbor faces in his life?
Yeah, so there's a good amount. The ones that instantly come to mind are, at first, he's actually warned about Sauron. when Sauron first appears as an emissary of the Valar. Elrond and Gil-galad and Galadriel are like, do not trust this guy. Don't trust him. And in one version of the story about the creation of the Rings of Power, Celebrimbor and his other smiths, they're a society called the Gwaith y Myrdain that Celebrimbor started. Celebrimbor and his other smiths, they rebel against Celeborn and Galadriel. And Galadriel and Celeborn basically kind of leave, kind of are kicked out of Eregion, and they eventually go to Lothlorien. And it wasn't like anything like crazy violent from what I understand. There's not too much information given in the text about this, but Celebrimbor was firmly on the side of Anatar, and I say that with quotes, because obviously we know that that was Sauron. So that was one of his big decisions that we can obviously see was very misguided. But he did genuinely think that Anatar was an emissary of the Valar. And then later down the road, when he figures out that Anatar is actually Sauron, he repents of what he did, and he actually goes back to Galadriel in Lothlorien for counsel. He's like, he's Sauron, what do I do? And so Galadriel actually counsels him at that point to hide the 3 elven rings. But he really, I think it demonstrates a very good sense of humility that his grandfather, I don't think ever would have. Because, as soon as he realizes that he's wrong, instantly goes to Galadriel. And then I think the big culmination of Celebrimbor's life, his choices, is after he makes the Rings of Power, and Sauron comes to Eregion in all of his wrath, and tries to take the rings back. He tortures Celebrimbor, and Celebrimbor gives him the information about the 9 and the 7, but he refuses to tell him about the 3. And I think that's a really powerful moment for Celebrimbor. Because it shows that, even under, the weight of torture, he still is trying to do his best to fight against evil. He's a very tragic figure. And I think that's part of what draws me to Celebrimbor so much, is that he is a very deeply flawed, I can't say man, elf. But he also he does really care, and he's trying to do the right thing, or trying to achieve both moral and physical beauty at the same time, which just makes for a very interesting combination. And it just speaks to Tolkien's skills as a writer, that he could create a character like that without actually writing a story about him. He wrote notes, and he wrote summaries, and a general kind of legend, myth, history, but we never actually, got to see it in full prose. But we can still get at some of what Celebrimbor was like as a person, as an elf.
Yeah, no, definitely. For sure. And so I think another thing, too, is thinking about good versus evil, and kind of like Celebrimbor versus Sauron. Now I think another thing, whenever I was looking at some things, is that some people were saying that Celebrimbor knew that Sauron, Anatar was Sauron, before he made the 3.
Yes. In
Is
the
that true? Okay.
in the original version, well, in the original version of the Legendarium, once Sauron basically it was revealed that he had created the One Ring, and the elves became aware of it, they all took off their rings immediately. They were furious, they were horrified, and Celebrimbor created the 3 without Sauron's touch. The Rings of Power TV show, for purposes of thematic cohesion, they actually switched the order up in their show. But originally, it was the 3 were created last. And so they were created after Sauron had basically already revealed his betrayal and fled Eregion.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's interesting to think about what is as you were kind of touching on it, okay, we have Celebrimbor, Galadriel, and even Elrond, I guess you were saying, had this idea of okay, we know this guy's kind of sketchy, Anatar, we can't trust him. But then you have Celebrimbor, who's very willing to be no, I want to see, I want to see what I can like do with this guy, make these rings or whatever. Do you think that that's part of like Celebrimbor coming from this line of Fëanor in that sense, or do you think that there's something else about his character that he was, I guess, more willing to trust Anatar?
Yeah, I think I mean, we kind of enter into speculation at this point because we don't have a clear kind of we have hints, but we don't have like a clear kind of thing, but it's just fascinating to speculate on. And I think Rings of Power actually does a good job exploring this concept specifically in the second season. Um, I personally think that Celebrimbor wanted Anatar to be real. I think that, he wanted to not only do a wonderful, beautiful thing with Anatar and make a wonderful partnership with him in creating beautiful things, but I also think that he wanted, like, validation, like, I am like my grandfather. Because his grandfather, his works, the Silmarils were hallowed by the Valar. So I think that Celebrimbor having an emissary of the Valar come to him is something I think is a very purposeful parallel that Tolkien wrote in between those two characters. That Celebrimbor is like, oh my gosh, this is a guy from the Valar, and he's kind of like he's validating me and my work. And I think that he really wanted Sauron to be that kind of person. He wanted him to be Anatar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. So, I think there are more similarities to Celeborn's character in Rings of Power, than kind of like I would have thought of like ahead of time. But I think, yeah, I'm trying to think like, I mean, it shows in the books that he was, he was deceived,
Hmm.
right? And that's what they put up in the Rings of Power as well.
Yeah.
So I think it's definitely accurate. I'm just trying to like think of like something that maybe like Rings of Power was trying to do in portraying Celebrimbor that might have been different
Mm.
from how like Tolkien was writing him.
Yeah. So there is one thing particularly. I will say this. For the longest time, I actually didn't like the casting of Celebrimbor in the show, especially during season one. Um, I guess it was mostly on me. I imagined Celebrimbor very differently, um, just in terms of like stature, and also just because Celebrimbor is actually possibly roughly closer to Elrond's age. So he's not like super super old as an elf. He's kind of more on like the younger end of elves. So having him portrayed as more of kind of like a stately, older elf in Middle Earth was. I mean, it's not like the end of the world, but it is kind of an odd choice. I felt like, and I also he like Celebrimbor is very physical. Like he's constantly working in the forge. He also is very skilled swordsman. Tolkien was very clear that he faced off against orc armies and eventually against Sauron, fighting him at the footsteps of the forge. So I definitely imagined Celebrimbor differently, and the show portrayed him as like a more stately, almost like more of a diplomat, but like more of like a refined craftsman and artisan. And I actually in season two, I think Charles Edwards, the actor, does an incredible job. He's a very very good actor. So he won me over with his performance in season two, but I still think that the casting it wasn't what I imagined, and I don't think it's what a lot of other fans imagined. So yeah.
Yeah. So do you think that there was that like Tolkien would have written more of a warrior side to Celebrimbor than they showed in Rings of Power?
Yeah, I'm really not sure. I think it's possible. With especially with how Celeborn would have been raised. His father was very warrior oriented. His again, like I've said, his father was not a great guy. His father also like his whole family was heavily involved in the war against Morgoth, the War of the Jewels. And so Celeborn would have been surrounded by that. Maybe he wouldn't have been a warrior, but he definitely would have known his way around a sword. I mean, he would have had to. So I think that there is definitely would have been more of, if Tolkien had written more about him, we definitely would have seen more of that kind of side.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I think like, hmm, I don't know. Like, I think the show definitely. I don't know. The one thing I might have a gripe with, and again, like, I'm not like super knowledgeable of this area, and like as you were saying, even I guess like there's not a whole ton of stuff on Celebrimbor to really say, but um, I, f- I just thought like they made Celebrimbor weaker in Rings of Power than like I would have wanted to see, but that was my opinion. um, no, there wasn't actually exactly anything there. I don't think Tolkien ever pushed this, but I think that it's something that I'm just like wanting to talk more about in some of my episodes. Um, so, like for instance, so we've got like a sovereign god, Iluvatar, who is in the story. When you go to Lord of the Rings, I think it's like easier to see some of these things because it's talking about characters more. It's building on character. I mean, not maybe not a whole ton of character arcs necessarily, but like more so than any other of the works, on Middle Earth. So, do you see? I guess here, like in Celebrimbor's lifetime, maybe it involves him directly or indirectly. Like, are there various things that, like, we say, like Iluvatar would be like having a hand um, in like the events that would affect Celebrimbor, I guess.
Yeah, so I think from the lore, there's nothing that you can like clearly kind of see, or you can point to and say, I think that this would have been a direct kind of like divine intervention. I actually think that the show, and I can talk about that in a second, I think the show actually includes that a bit more. Um, but with when it comes to Celebrimbor, I think something that potentially could have had an effect with divine intervention is uh, the fact that he immediately like repented, like once he realized. And I think that that is, obviously that's a very strong kind of Christian motif, and that's actually the word that Tolkien uses, repented, of his actions and his feelings towards Anatar as soon as he realized what he'd done, and then also trying to go and make right what he had done, especially with like getting counsel from Galadriel and asking what he should do about the rings and scattering them. And he tries his best to do what he can to undo the rings, but at the same time, he still doesn't destroy them. And none of the elves do. So I that can't be put on Celebrimbor alone. I think that was actually like a big failure, a moral failure of the elves. Um, and I understand like the reasons why. But that's something that Rings of Power explores. But yeah, I think from the lore, just from what we see, there isn't necessarily any moment of like divine intervention. But when it comes to the Rings of Power show, the one thing that kind of comes to mind is Celebrimbor's foresight. And that's something that definitely comes into play right at the end. When he basically makes his big speech to Sauron as he's dying. I foresee that one of the rings will be your undoing. I thought that was a really nice touch, and it was a great, tie to Lord of the Rings, but it also was like a really good moment of acknowledging that, elves are sometimes able to see beyond. And I think that that could be interpreted as something related to divine intervention.
Yes, for sure. I do like try to be pretty even in a lot of sense with like comparing like the lore and the show, and um I try to be kind of like try to figure out, okay, are there like things I can push and like kind of be a little bit more like negative than usual on certain aspects. But honestly, with Celebrimbor, it's like I think that they did things fairly well with that.
Yeah,
There's not really much you can like really say like, oh yeah, and you
I
figure out more that like there's less on this general storyline than maybe people realize.
mhm. I mean, if you take everything with Celebrimbor and like put it into a Word document, I think at most you'd have like 3 pages, and some of it would repeat. just because of the various different versions that Tolkien wrote. I think that because I'll say this as a Rings of Power fan, I am well aware of the canon divergences that it goes and the rabbit trails that it goes on. I will 100% agree to that. I just happen to like some of those, but I understand people's frustrations with them. But I will say that like the Celebrimbor storyline, besides the changing of his actual character instead of being more young, possibly more warrior bent, to like a kind of an older statesman, um, I think that overall they nail Celebrimbor's characterization. I think that was something that the writers were very, very invested in, and it shows. And yes, they changed up the order of the rings, but overall they did keep to the fact that the three were not touched by Sauron. That actually becomes a strong plot point in the first episode. And also that once Celebrimbor realized what happened, he repented and he tried to make things right. And he actually talked to Galadriel about, trying to find hope again and light, and that there is a light beyond, anything that we can see, and be above and beyond all of this darkness that's happening currently in front of them.
Was that from the show
Yes,
that you were quoting? Okay.
that specific scene was from the show. Um, and again, like, so also with Celebrimbor, he's very focused on making things of beauty. He actually also in the Lord of the Rings books, we do get information that he was the one who made the Elf Stone, which is very important in the story of Arwen and Aragorn. It was actually considered his second greatest work, besides the Three Rings of the Elves. And again, like he was always concerned with trying to capture beauty, and he and Galadriel have a conversation. It's a very brief recorded conversation. It's actually one of the only times we ever have words from Celebrimbor directly. They're kind of lamenting the fact that decay is coming upon Middle Earth, and how they kind of wish that they could have timelessness that's only available in Valinor here in Middle Earth. And so I think that the Rings of Power, it portrays that very strongly, especially in the first season, because it's a very strong theme in the first season, is that the elves are really noticing the decay happening around them, and that they might have to leave if they want to, remain in the timelessness of Valinor and not fade away. So yeah, I think that that is an important part of Celebrimbor's character, that I'm glad to see was expounded upon in the show. And it is something that's directly pulled from the lore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Neat. Well, thanks, Jared, for coming on and talking about Celebrimbor and his life and themes and comparing the lore and the show. Yeah.
Yeah, happy to be on.
Yeah, always great having you on. So, yeah. Well, thanks everybody, and catch us for our next episode next week.